So far in this course, we discussed about basic cloud concepts that you should be aware of before deep dive for the cloud certification. We will talk about AWS cloud certifications and cover the topics for AWS Cloud Practitioner exam. So let's get started. AWS has its customers across the globe and every customer wants the better performance of their applications. So AWS hosted its infrastructure globally and designed the infrastructure to provide the low latency and high speed access to AWS services for its customers. AWS has wide range of services to offer to its customers, and its cloud concepts are broadly categorized into four different categories. AWS Global Infrastructure that include physical infrastructures like regions, availability zones, local zones as locations. The other broad category is security and compliance that include the security control and compliance certifications. Next, we have architecture on AWS that include best practices for deployment and operations on the AWS cloud. And then AWS services that include compute, storage, database, networking, and other services offered by AWS. So we will talk about each components in detail in this course. So first, let's talk about the AWS global infrastructure. AWS has customers across the globe and every customer wants the better performance of the application. AWS hosted its infrastructure globally to provide the low latency and high speed access of AWS services to its customers. AWS global infrastructure include the multiple components like regions. A region is a geographical area where AWS hosted its physical infrastructure. There are multiple regions, and each region consists of multiple availability zones. Availability zones. Within region, we have availability zones, and each availability zone contains multiple data centers for high availability. Local zones bring cloud more closer to users and provide the low latency access of AWS services to customers. As locations used to deliver content with better performance to end users and used as a content delivery network. Direct connect locations are physical locations where customer can establish a dedicated connection to AWS to access the cloud resources. So don't worry if you are not aware about any of these components. We will talk about these components in detail and we'll see how you can utilize these core components of AWS global infrastructure to host your applications on the cloud. First, let's talk about the AWS region. Every customer wants to host the application closer to their location for better performance. So AWS has hosted its physical data centers at multiple geographical locations in the world. Regions are those geographical areas where AWS decide to host their physical data centers. So customers can choose a data center close to them to host their applications. AWS has multiple regions and each AWS region can have one or more availability zones. You can host your application in closest AWS region for better performance. The closer is the region, the better is the performance for the users. At the time of this recording, AWS currently has 30 regions globally. AWS keep on adding the new regions on time to time basis. You can always get the updated list of AWS regions and availability zones from the Amazon official website. To get the updated list of AWS regions and availability zone, let's go to the Amazon official website, aws.amazon.com. And if you scroll down the page, at the bottom of the page, you will see the section Global Network of AWS region. And this is the list of the AWS regions where AWS has hosted its region across the globe. There are two color dots, the green one and the red one. The green dot means the AWS region is official and you can host your applications in this region. And the red zone means the AWS region is coming soon and it's not yet ready to host the applications for the users. And if you want to see how many availability zones are hosted in each region, just click on the list view. And here you will see the number of availability zone in each AWS region. So if you are planning to host your applications on AWS cloud, you can always come to aws.amazon.com to confirm the closest AWS region. Next, let's talk about availability zones. Availability zones are physical locations where multiple data centers are hosted. Availability zone exists within AWS region. There are multiple availability zones within a region which are connected to each other with high speed and low latency network. So first, we have AWS regions. Within each AWS region, there are one or more availability zone, and each availability zone has one or more data centers connected to each other with high speed links. The availability zones are designed to provide high level availability for your applications and data. In simple terms, availability zone is a collection of data centers within a region with redundant power, network, and connectivity to enable the high availability of your applications. Meaning, if one data center within a region goes down, the users will still be able to access their application via other data center in the availability zone. It is important to note that each availability zone is associated with a specific AWS region. Availability zone has a clusters of data center within a region with redundant power, networking, and connectivity to enable the high availability of your application. There are currently 96 availability zones globally in 30 regions. Now let's just take a high level look at some regions within India. So if you want to validate the availability zones within region, just hover over the name of the region. You see that in Mumbai region, we have three availability zone and two local zone. In Hyderabad region, we have three availability zones. You can also click on list view and see the region name for which you want to find how many availability zones are there. So we are talking about India. So in India, we have two regions. One is Mumbai region that's launched in 2016. Here we have three availability zones and two local zones. And in Hyderabad region, we have only three availability zones. So we talked about AWS regions and availability zone. So when we plan to host a application on AWS, be it for mobile users, home users, or corporates, we get an option to select the region and availability zone to host the application. Once you host the application, then user can access the application via internet or direct connect based on your application architecture. When one of the data center in availability zone goes down, your application will be accessed via redundant data center. And if in worst case, complete availability zone goes down, you can access your application via redundant availability zone. So when you create a resource in AWS, you get an option to select the region and availability zone within that region to host your resources. For example, you might see something like US West 1A. So let's break it down and understand what it means. So first, you might guess that US in the beginning stands for the United States, and you would be correct. Yeah, this is going to be the area. We then have a sub area within that main area. So in this case, this would be the western side of the US. We then have a number because we might have two different regions or more in a specific area. And this is the case. We have both US West 1, which is Northern California, and US West 2, which is Oregon. But we leave off the latter, that gives us the region name. So when we are talking about a region, we would say US West 1 as a region. But if you want the entire availability zone name, it would include everything from US West all the way to 1A. So we talked about AWS availability zone. Let's quickly summarize the key points of availability zone. Resiliency. Each AWS availability zone is a physically separate and independent data center with its own power, cooling, and networking infrastructure. Redundancy. AWS deploys multiple availability zones in a region to ensure high availability and fault tolerance of your application. In general, there are at least two and up to six availability zones per region. High availability. AWS availability zone within a region are interconnected with high-speed, low-latency networks to enable the data replication and communication between them. AWS availability zone are designed to provide high availability, and AWS guarantees at least 99.99% availability of application. Deployment. AWS recommends to design your application to be highly available across multiple availability zones to ensure maximum uptime and fault tolerance. You can launch the resources such as EC2 instance, RDS database, and Elastic Load Balancer in one or more availability zone to achieve the high availability and fault tolerance of your application. The cost of deploying the resources across multiple availability zones may be higher than deploying the resource in single availability zone. AWS also provides cross-region replication to help you replicate data between regions. AWS availability zone may have resource limitations such as the number of instances that you can launch or the type of instances that are available in a specific region. So when you are designing your application for AWS, you should consider all these points before hosting your infrastructure on the AWS cloud. Next, let's talk about AWS local zone. You would like to host your infrastructure closer to the end users. And AWS can't build the data centers everywhere, so AWS come up with a solution of local zone. Local zones are like mini data center that places compute, storage, database, and other AWS services closer to end user. You can place resources such as compute and storage at multiple locations closer to the end users. AWS local zones place compute, storage, database, and other AWS services closer to end users. Each local zone is an extension of a AWS region. Local zones provide a high bandwidth and secure connection between local workload and those running in the AWS region. Local zones are essentially a way for AWS to bring the cloud closer to the customers, providing customers with more localized, high performance service with the same level of security and compliance as the main AWS infrastructure. To use the local zone, we need to enable it first, and then we can host our resources in the local zone. Next, let's talk about AWS point of presence. AWS point of presence refers to the physical location where AWS has placed its infrastructure outside of AWS region. The point of presence connected to the AWS regions with high-speed network to provide access to AWS services. Point of presence are spread around the world, which enable the customer to access the services with the lowest possible latency. You can think of AWS point of presence as gateway to the cloud. They allow the customers to access the services such as Amazon EC2, S3, and RDS from any location with the low latency, high throughput, and high availability. Within the overall points of presence, there are two types of infrastructure: as locations and regional cache. Next, let's talk about as locations. AWS as locations are places around the world where AWS has hosted its servers. These servers used to cache and serve the content such as website pages, images, and videos to users as quickly as possible. As locations keep a copy of the content closer to the user so that it can be delivered quickly. So when you use an app or website that is hosted on AWS, the information you need is delivered to you from one of these as locations. These as locations are distributed around the world and are used by services such as Amazon CloudFront or Route 53 to deliver the content with low latency and high performance. And if you are not aware about CloudFront and Route 53, don't worry, we will talk about these in next module. By placing servers in as locations, AWS is able to provide a faster and more reliable experience to users around the world. As locations are especially beneficial for the users located far away from the main location, which can help to improve the performance of websites, streaming services, and other content delivery. For example, if you wanted to create a single page application and you want to be sure that your application could be served as quickly as possible to all the users across the globe, and then let's say you have a user in South Africa or from other part of the world where AWS doesn't have its region. Well, you could make sure that your application could be served from the as location in South Africa via Amazon CloudFront instead of making the users go to wherever the next closest AWS region would be. So AWS as location actually increases the performance of the application for the user. Next, let's talk about the waveland zone. A waveland zone is a logical extension of the region. It's a new type of AWS infrastructure designed to run the workload that require ultra low latency over the mobile network. AWS deploy its infrastructure within communication service providers network, so application traffic from 5G devices can reach the servers running in the waveland zone without leaving the telecommunication network. Waveland zone is fully integrated with AWS services such as Lambda, S3, and DynamoDB. Waveland zone allow the developers to deploy and run the applications on the as of 5G network. Currently, waveland zones are available in a very limited availability. Waveland zone is a fully managed and scalable service. The application can then be hosted in waveland zone that is co-located within a mobile provider's data center. An example of how an application might use the AWS waveland zone is an online gaming application that is designed for mobile users. Traditionally, this kind of applications would be hosted in a central data center which would then be accessed by mobile users over the internet. But with AWS Waveland Zone, the application can now be hosted in Waveland Zone that is co-located within a mobile network provider's data center. That means the mobile user of that application don't need to travel outside of mobile provider's network to access the application. So this gives the ultra low latency access of applications for all mobile users.